In the 1960s, a football genius burst onto the scene. He graced us with his talent, dazzled us with his beauty, and was so far ahead of his time that he would prove to be the forerunner of every modern football superstar. He loved women. He loved life. But most of all, he loved to kick a ball around. His name was George Best.
It was like Roy of the Rovers. The hero dashing forward, you know, the poor old fullback on his backside looking absolutely hot. And this happened.
Wherever I go, people say to me, who's the best you've ever played against? Three come to mind: Cruyff, Pelé and George.
And he attracted just some of the most magnificent looking women you've ever seen in your life.
He looked like a pop star, and yet he was a footballer.
He was the first footballer with the pop star image, and it all got out of hand.
I was very young. I knew nothing about alcohol. I knew nothing about alcoholics.
To be fair to George, the reason I like him so much is he's never blamed anybody else but himself.
He was a cult figure then. He was a hero then. He was a legend then. What would he have been now?
George Best grew up on a Belfast council estate, and before long was showing the talent that would make him famous.
If you ever wanted to find George, he just looked up around the street and he was in the field up around with the ball, winter, summer, whatever.
George's precocious skills were soon spotted by United's local scout, Bob Bishop. At 15, Best was invited for a trial at Old Trafford along with another local lad, Eric McMordy.
Obviously, we're very, very excited because to get the opportunity of coming out of youth team football and boys' school football and go to Manchester United was a dream probably for the two of us.
At Old Trafford in them days, they just used to give a couple of lads that's a little bit older. Used to have to look out for people, and it was my job to look out for George.
That was the first trip I think George and I both had away from home as well. And really, after that, it sort of overawed the two of us a little bit, so it did, by meeting a lot of the very, very famous people that we were actually mixing with.
He was very, very shy, and I didn't do a very good job because he'd run home after a couple of days. He was homesick.
Sort of quite famous after one day. The two of us left Manchester United and went back home again, which, looking back now, was very foolish.
United's pastoral care had been far from perfect, but soon Best was persuaded to return. This time, Manchester United's manager Matt Busby was determined that his potential star would not go missing. George was sent to live in Diggs with Mrs. Fullaway and her family in the Manchester suburb of Chorlton.
Football was just all we ever did. And when George arrived, that was the same as. He kicked the same ball as we did.
The Manchester United that George found himself a part of was very much a club in transition. In 1958, United's team of Busby Babes had crashed on the runway in Munich. 8 players died and the club was devastated. Matt Busby himself was in a critical condition and twice given the last rites.
It was dreadful, terrible thing that happened. And you then followed them even more closely, Manchester United, because of the heroism and Matt Busby coming off virtually his deathbed to make a team again.
You rebuild with senior professionals that you have to purchase, which costs you a lot of money, or you choose from your own nursery.
In 1962, Matt Busby paid a record £115,000 to buy Denis Law from Italian giants Torino. Law was to be the catalyst for Busby's new team. But if George was to join him in the United first team, he needed to grow.
He was very, very thin. That was the thing I noticed. I thought, now this could be a problem. But he was His balance was tremendous, that was another thing. His movement, the control, he could keep a ball close to his feet.
Keep on running from my arms.
It was like a gift. Everybody was, you know, fascinated. But because he was so tiny, people doubted that he'd grow and be strong enough. But George had a heart of a lion.
George was also finding his feet in Manchester and settling well at Mrs. Fullaway's digs. The shy Belfast lad had discovered a home from home with a landlady who doted on him.
Well, if it hadn't been for Mrs. Fullaway, he'd have gone back to Belfast and stayed in Belfast. Mrs. Fullaway was his mum in Manchester. He had two mums, one in Belfast and one in Manchester. She was just a fabulous lady. She was a typical footballer's landlady, which means that they always know how to look after you and make sure that you feel it's a home for you.
She loved him like a mum, and she was a really nice lady. She was a bit like my mum. As soon as you walked in the door, would you like a cup of tea, Kelly?
We used to go to the local church playing bingo with my mum on a Sunday evening, and then to the local pub with my mum again, and we were only allowed a shandy because we weren't old enough.
She kept the secrets as well, you know. She protected George, you know, protected us all, actually.
Soon there would be plenty to protect the young George from, as even in the youth squad he was starting to attract his own female following.
We used to go to watch United, and there was this young lad came over from Ireland. I thought, oh, he's, you know, it's a bit of all right.
And I think all the women wanted to mother him, and some wanted to smother him. Do you know what I mean?
George was now being pursued relentlessly by girls. He didn't usually put up much of a fight. But if he did, they still would not be denied.
They got in illicit ways through windows and up ladders and all sorts. It wasn't necessarily his doing, it was like tap, tap, tap on the window, you know. But it was difficult when two of us in a single room, so there wasn't a lot of hanky-panky went on in the house.
I first saw George Best in his very first game he played for Manchester United. I think he was 16 at the time.
He brought him in when he played against West Brom.
Almost the first time I saw George play was when he came into the first team.
Charles has made 10 yards straight. That's great. Best running forward.
West Brom had an international fullback called Graham Williams.
And he was a real rough bugger, you know, and everyone said, oh, he'll hammer him.
Pull down.
George loved dribbling and loved getting the ball and showing what he could do, and turned the fullback inside out.
What a great man this Philip Best is.
About 20 years, 3 centuries later, I was with George outside of Stamford Bridge, and we bumped into Graham Williams. And Graham Williams said to George, will you just stand there for a minute? I want to look at your face. And George said, why? He said, because the only view I've ever had of you up to now is your arse disappearing down the wing.
He had numerous tricks because he was a great dribbler of the ball.
Everybody liked dribblers. Everybody liked people that can control the ball, and you could see them on the edge of the seats.
Only a few can do that, because you'd all be sat there, but you'd move forward. And the air of expectancy, you think, what's he going to do here?
He could run as quick with the ball as he could without it.
It wasn't slow coming at you, it was like an express train, and you never knew which way he was going to go. And he could check, and he could go right, and then he could go left.
He had a fantastic cat-like balance. He was just a will-o'-the-wisp. You're just never comfortable when he had the ball when you were playing against him, because he would always beat you.
George basically was a marked man virtually every game that he played, and George had the marks to prove that.
Well, I don't know why I came here tonight. I got the feeling that something ain't right.
numerous times after games. I've seen his legs, I've seen not just his legs, his back.
There was some real rough fellas that went out and tried to kick him, like I say, sky high in the air, but he overtook all that, put up with all that intimidation.
It was such a joy to watch George play in Chelsea, because Chelsea had a defender called Chopper Harris who was just a nightmare. He was going to scare the living daylights out of Boris Karloff.
Might foul there with Harris on Best, and he had a bang in the back.
I had a specific job to stop George from playing. It wasn't always successful, but that was my job.
And to see that confrontation between George, the artist, and Chopper, the butcher boy, made it worth every penny.
I remember we played up there in a League Cup tie one evening. After about 10-15 minutes of the second half, I remember Alan Hudson taking this in-swinging corner. Jimmy Rimmer come out and punched this ball about 25 yards, and Bestie got on the ball, and I thought to myself, well, there's your chance, Chop.
George was that quick, and he saw it coming.
I half caught him and half missed him, really. He managed to stay on his feet, and he ran and stuck the ball in the back of the net, and we lost 2-1.
Can he do it? He surely must.
You know, George was a superb player. You know, one of the best players I ever attempted to kick in 21 years.
What a goal to score! Who could score it but George Best?
I can remember even against Bobby Moore and people like that for West Ham, making them look pretty ordinary and sending them the wrong way, and then coming back and doing it again.
You're just too good to be true.
You know, beating him once wasn't quite sufficient. He liked to sort of take him back, beat him again, and just to round it off once again.
He stood in the ball and he begged like a matador, come on, take me on. And you've not only got to be good to do that and get away with it, you've got to be better than good.
You're just too good to be true.
He didn't want to humiliate them, but he wanted to show how good he was. And there's nothing wrong in that. If you've got it, flaunt it.
There's nothing else to compare. The sight of you leaves me.
When you've got this thirst for the game and love for the game, you want to play it and you want the ball. And then, of course, George used to get the ball, but he didn't always give it away.
Please let me know that it's real. You're just too good to be true.
You'd be in a position to receive the ball of George. He wouldn't give you it. You'd play hell, and he could skin 2 or 3 defenders, score a goal, and you felt such a bloody fool that you've actually been shouting at him, you know.
Ferran forward to Best. Oh, he's going to get number 5, yes!
He'd never give it you. He would use you, and you would think you were going to get it, but suddenly he was off in a different direction.
Bobby Charlton and Dennis Law, they're all screaming, give us the ball, George, give us the ball. He didn't, he dribbled round the last defender. And they say, you greedy little great goal, George.
Styles, trying to work a position, Best, yes,
It was really frustrating, I suppose, at that time. But at the end of the day, when he scored a fantastic goal, you would say, well, you know, how can you argue about it?
William coming back with it. Best with his perfect balance. Again, over the long.
With George becoming the complete player, he was at the heart of United's Holy Trinity. Best, Law and Charlton.
Best to Charlton. What a goal!
It seemed to roll off the tongue, you know, best Law and Charlton, and I was quite flattered with that.
Best. Law, yes!
Law, Best, Charlton, everybody in the world spoke about them. But they was all different as players. They all had different assets as players.
I'm very proud that I was one of those 3.
And I would say on the field they got on great. Off the field they didn't social much.
And that's why a lot of rumours went round that, oh, they didn't get on together, you know, but they had different lifestyles.
Bobby Charlton obviously was married, and you know, after a game he used to go home to his wife and his kids and all that.
Dennis Law used to go straight home because Di had 5 children. Bobby wasn't never what you call a townie.
George was single and used to go out.
Well, we're never friends. I was older than he was. I had a different lifestyle than George had. We weren't sort of in each other's cup. We didn't need to be. We were in a different age group.
You didn't have to love your teammate, but you respected him, and that's what they had. And there was certainly respect for each other there.
Having won the league in 1965, Busby set off again in pursuit of the European dream that he thought had died in Munich. 19-year-old George took the field against the mighty Benfica of Portugal.
You keep saying you got something for me.
For those who really saw him play, the match against Benfica was...
European matches were a rarity in those days, and it was quite scary, the idea of going all the way to Portugal to play these strange foreigners. It was quite a daunting prospect, you know, for the fans, let alone the players.
Benfica playing all in white kick-off in this absolutely packed Stadium of Light.
To go to the Stadium of Light in Lisbon, you just didn't go and expect to come away with anything, you know.
Manchester United with a 3-2 lead from the first leg, but facing a great task.
Obviously the crowds were always up for it and up for the home side. So the idea was to sort of calm things down and quieten them down, and then, you know, maybe come out from there and play.
Taking it up for Eusebio.
George, that particular day, was on fire, really.
Oh, beautifully intercepted by Best. Great little player, this boy is.
He looked fast, he looked fit, everything that you'd want him to be. Because anything other than that, we knew, you know, we would lose.
Down for the free kick. Up goes Best, he scored! Best has got a goal for Manchester United.
I think he headed one over the goalkeeper, and then he turned another one in just inside the post.
Here comes Best again. What a player this boy is, he's got another!
And you can imagine the excitement.
12 minutes gone, and Best surely has now finished the task.
They laughed at his haircut when they first saw him, the Portuguese. They weren't laughing at the end of the night. They were crying. They'd never seen anything like it.
Inspired by George, United ran out 5-1 winners in a match that would go down in history as one of Best's all-time great performances.
When you're a genius like George Best, it comes to the forefront one day, and in that particular game, people suddenly stood back and said, hang on.
Best with a cheekiest of all cheeky little flicks by this supreme cheeky champion, George Best.
That was one of his great games. Maybe the best game he ever played, that, because he was unstoppable.
Things would never be the same again for George Best. With pop star looks and a distinctive sense of style, he returned from Lisbon to a hero's welcome and instant celebrity.
George Best, this young, slim, handsome Beatle type. No wonder he got the name, the El Beatle.
You know you make me wanna shout.
And he was a huge star. I mean, overnight. It didn't just happen gradually. One minute he was there, and the next minute he was this huge star.
He would stop the traffic in those days. I mean, he was a great-looking kid. He had long hair. He looked like the Beatles. And he was just amazing.
I mean, that was a very beautiful man. I mean, natural beauty, the gypsy look and the dark hair and the eyes, and God, he was handsome.
I actually went out with Georgia Best. We'd go to the clubs together, I'd go to the match, and he'd take me home. He was just unbelievable. Unbelievable.
Everybody wants to take him home. Not to meet their mum either.
And there's George with sort of flowing black hair and sort of that magical twinkle in his eye and his feet. And suddenly women, girls, were going to football matches.
I want you to know.
We used to stand near the corner flag, and when he used to come and take a corner, I just thought it was absolutely gorgeous.
Every time he got the ball, there must have been 10,000 teenage girls there. They screamed.
We'd never seen anybody like this before. You know, as a footballer, footballers still had short back and sides and long baggy shorts, and they were everything but glamorous. And all of a sudden, this extraordinary, it was as if Elizabeth Taylor had taken up the game. You know, it was remarkable.
He made the jump from football into show business.
George was the first of his kind to have that sort of adulation, really. He was a new era coming, and he was the leader of that, first one in.
The 60s was definitely a time of opportunity, and Georgie flowered during that time.
There was a whole new style of pop stars, and George brought sport into that. And everywhere he went, you know, that sort of there would be people wanting to meet him, photographers waiting to photograph him, and he just got bigger and bigger and bigger.
George was the first one that actually, press actually started following.
Well, they used to camp out outside my mum's house, and where we lived was a cul-de-sac, and we were at the bottom end of the cul-de-sac. So basically, they could block you in if you like.
Must have been very difficult for George. You have to be a special type of person to be able to cope with that all the time.
For a quiet, shy lad, you know, to have all this world adoring him overnight, it was hard to take, in all honesty.
But if Best was a star among stars at United, in Northern Ireland he was without doubt the single most famous person in the whole of the country. A world-class player in a team of few stars.
He looked brilliant in that red and white shirt, but I always thought he looked better in a green and white shirt. And maybe that's because he was carrying the hopes of the whole country.
Oh, well, I suppose the one that sticks in the mind of everyone here that was at the game was this game against Scotland.
George gave probably the finest exhibition I've seen of any professional footballer in my life, I would say.
And Best. Oh, beautiful football. This man is a genius. Stewart now finding Best. Well, Best is really wrapping them in.
He really turned it on that occasion. He just couldn't seem to do anything wrong. The ball, as if it was a magnet at his feet.
And Best fighting for everything. Here he goes again. I think that ball's tied to his feet.
To do it in front of a Belfast crowd who really appreciate George basically as like God in Ireland.
Best. Oh, what a great shot. What a player. And how the crowd love him.
1.5 million people in Northern Ireland, and we could turn up at our international stadium, and there, in front of our very eyes, was a world superstar.
Here's Best, the hero of the Irish now.
There were probably two players that the whole world knew. One was Pelé, and the other was George Best.
With his superstar status confirmed, George Best was an advertiser's dream. Sex appeal and football were a potent combination, and Best was the only young man who combined them so explosively.
He was the only footballer that really brought the footballers to attention of businesses, saying, wow, we can use him in commercials, we can use him in advertising. He's the first person.
It takes a lot to get George Best away from football, but one thing always works, his mum's cooking, especially when it's Cookstown sausages.
What the man means is Cookstown are the best family sausages.
Everybody wanted George. You know, they wanted him to model new clothes, do new haircuts, and everybody wanted a bit of him.
He could have sold snow to Eskimos. I mean, he was that marketable.
Oh, well, I just bought out anything that had his picture in it and posters from the United Souvenir Shop.
I had a George Best ring with a little picture of George, a George Best necklace, and I'm a man who abhors jewellery.
I got a pair of George Best boots that actually did up down the side. Not quite sure why they did it up down the side, and they're incredibly uncomfortable. And I think I threw them out after about 3 matches, but at least they had George Best's signature along the side of them.
He also used to model for a mail order catalogue, so of course we used to get that as well.
George's interest in fashion led him to open a boutique with close friend and Manchester City footballer Mike Summerbee.
People followed what he wore, so he was in the right business for it. If he wore a pair of shoes, we'd probably have the shoes in there and people would come and buy them.
We'd go down to the boutique, trying on the different fashions, some quite outrageous ones like pants with different colour legs and stuff like that.
Best wrote the rules for the wannabe football superstar with the right haircut, the right clothes, and the right car.
He had one of the first E-Type Jags, you know, and he had one of the first Lotus when they come out, all the flashy ones.
He turned up in a flipping white Rolls Royce one day. I've bought this. He still looks like all pile in and we'll go round the block.
He gave me a lift once and it had the most outrageous car, but it wasn't enough that it was functional, you know, it had to be flashy. And there was this tiny little car, and I literally couldn't get in. I'd got halfway through trying to get in and we both burst out laughing. But he had to have it. He had to have it.
By the late 60s, there seemed no trace of that shy Belfast lad to all but his closest friends. It was 24-hour party time, and everyone clamoured for an invitation.
I felt he was very much the Pied Piper, because wherever he went, people followed.
I mean, you went into a club and there was a knot of people gathered around. You could be certain that, like the Queen Bee, there's Bestie in the middle of it.
Good evening, George. How are you? Nice to see you this evening.
He would walk into a place very quietly, and as if anything, I'd kind of slide in down the stairs into a little corner, sit down, and of course, around him it would all happen. He was a really nice guy, you see, that was it. He was never big shot.
Getting to know him wasn't difficult because he wasn't surrounded by any kind of protection. That may be one of the problems that George has had during his life, that he grew up, and because he was isolated, because he was a mystery to people. I mean, what do you do with a footballer like this?
Couldn't say no to anybody. Would have a drink with anybody, would spend time with anybody. Just a special, terrific lad. But in many ways, that to me left him open and vulnerable to what could go on outside football.
People want to make themselves known to him, and how do you can't say there's a £20 note, I want to be your pal. The only way you can do it is say, will you have a drink, George? And of course, he found it hard to say no.
I never thought of George as being a drinker, really. I never thought of him as being a big drinker, not at all. He enjoyed himself, but no, I never thought of him as a big drinker.
He was not a big drinker. It happened as he went along. It was people, in effect, putting it in his hand.
I think really, when you think about it, the shyness might have been a problem in that way. He could express himself on the football field. I think off the field a little bit, he just needed a little push to bring that personality out, because he's a very quiet man.
It's true to say that not a lot of people were able to protect him because they just didn't understand what was happening.
One, he was the most gifted footballer that even Sir Matt Busby had ever had under his care. Secondly, the phenomena of the pop idol footballer was absolutely unknown. And if you put those two things together, no one had any experience of how to deal with someone like George Best.
On the field, George was at the peak of his powers. In 1968, United faced Real Madrid in the semi-final of the European Cup, and George's goal helped send them on their way to a famous final.
Aston, going well for him. Best! Oh, a real good goal!
10 years after the Munich air disaster, it seemed that Manchester United would finally realise their dream of European glory. With an emotionally charged final at Wembley, only old rivals Benfica could deny United.
And the stadium has just risen to the two teams as they come out. The unmistakable figure of George Best.
Manchester United went in as great favourites to win that because they had beaten Real Madrid. But the final was a great deal more difficult than many had expected.
The biggest fear, of course, as far as we were concerned, is that we were wearing blue shirts, and we'd never done that before. And it was a bit of a shock to the system for United fans to suddenly be cheering on a team in all blue.
United playing in blue kicked off.
The first half was 0-0, and it was a very dour sort of game, as typically Benfica really tried to stop George playing.
George Best fell foul of the first of a series of savage tackles which marred the first half.
But he was kicked a lot. I think it was an Italian referee, allowed things to go on. And George was taking some hellish stick.
But he got over it, he rode a lot of tackles and he got a few knocks. But second half, although we scored early on.
Hard-working Best put the ball out to the left. The return centre was a beauty. Charlton headed it home.
They equalised, and then we're really under a bit of pressure.
The match was by no means won. Benfica pulled off a beauty through Grassa.
We thought this is one we could lose, and they nearly did in the last minute, or the last few minutes, when Eusebio broke through.
Maybe a little lift again, you think, well, maybe it is our turn.
90 minutes up and still deadlock. The teams were weary, but the fans weren't. With an extra 30 minutes of play ahead, bumps, bruises and tired muscles ached like they'd never ached before.
When it got to extra time, there was no way that we were going to lose because they didn't want to play extra time.
And George started it all off, of course.
At some stage in the game, he was going to unlock the door somewhere along the line, and he did that night again.
I kicked the ball down the field, Brian Kidd got a knock on, and George got onto it.
As soon as he got the ball, as soon as he was on his way through, I thought, well, that's a goal, no question.
And controlling it brilliantly, going round the defenders.
Delaying it when he had the opportunity seemed to take rather longer than he needed to.
1 against 1 against the goalkeeper. Well, you don't shoot. No, I'd dribble it round. It's much more difficult. So he dribbled down the goalkeeper and he slotted it into the back of the net.
Every time I see it, you know, I think that's typical of George. Did George do that deliberately because he wanted to tease him?
That was it then that I knew that they would win this European Cup.
Watch this fantastic goal.
They just collapsed. You know, they were obviously trying really hard, and once it became just too much for them, they collapsed completely.
Charlton in the middle, so goes Aston. Charlton, another!
Then we just cruised for the last 15 minutes, and the whistle went, and Manchester United had won it. It was magic.
Manchester United had well and truly done it. At last, Matt Busby, the maestro of Manchester United, had groomed a team great enough to beat Europe's best.
It was very emotional. It was very emotional because of what had happened in Munich, and the lads had died in Munich trying to achieve a European Cup win, you know. And I think that Man United wouldn't really ever feel satisfied until they'd achieved that.
Every single player more or less went to Matt Busby, and George was one of those.
And I had tears in my eyes and a lump in my throat, you know, because I knew what it meant to both of them.
Without his calibre of player, you know, you couldn't possibly win a European Cup. It's just too difficult.
With the European Cup under his belt, so much more seemed destined for George Best. But what he wasn't to know on that warm night in May 1968 was that he had already reached the zenith of his career at just 22 years of age. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. It probably didn't look like George's new house in Bramhall, Cheshire.
He had a new house in Manchester called Quai Seurat, which is a strange place.
It was an eyesore. I mean, it was supposed to be futuristic at the time. It was all done in white marble.
Local people said it looked a bit like a public toilet because it was white tiles.
We used to call it the Kazi. It looked like a public loo.
It was a wonderful house inside. It looked horrible outside, but inside it was really lovely.
Very big sort of plate glass windows. I think there was an open plan staircase. A red and white bathroom, I believe, with a sunken bath.
For George, that was like his bolt hole, that was going to be his hideaway. And of course, it was no such thing.
I remember going to his housewarming party. It was a fabulous night. Everybody was there, and then afterwards, I think he realised he'd set himself in a situation in a goldfish bowl he could have well done without.
I did on one occasion go round to his house with a Valentine card and get a couple of photographs signed. He was very polite, yes. I mean, he was probably fed up with it, but yeah, he opened the door and signed the photographs, no problem.
Everybody used to get there. Used to be hundreds and hundreds, literally thousands of people looking in at you.
There were actually coach loads. There were coaches parked in the lane outside from Stoke, from Birmingham, from Shropshire, just to come and stare at George Best's house. In fact, he became a prisoner in his own house, really. You know, he didn't move out.
Struggling to find a secure home environment, George was also seeking reassurance at Old Trafford, where Manchester United were approaching a crossroads after achieving the pinnacle of their success.
There's that feeling of what do we do now, you know, once you've won the European Cup.
Where do you go from there at 22, you know? Where do you go from there?
I don't think the preparation had been done to take the club on further from that.
They were getting older, and Busby, so the trouble was, so was Busby, and he wasn't bringing in new players.
There should have been another great Manchester United team that was focused around George, and it never happened.
So, as the team started to fall to pieces, George got, lost, started losing interest.
When you're a genius, things are not the same as being a normal person. You react in different ways, because you can't get any better than what you are.
Increasingly a remote figure in an unravelling club, George was still a prime target for football's hard men. But tackles he shrugged off as a teenager now provoked retaliation. Battles with authority mounted, and alcohol, that had once been the lubricant of celebration, now became the refuge from defeat.
Like a lot of young men, George drank a lot, probably drank more than was good for him. I certainly used to drink more than was good for me when I was with George.
George then started to get his problem, not because Manchester United's results went bad, because he did have this problem.
We never recognised it as as that at the time. I mean, it was just an excess of something. In George's case, an excess of alcohol.
As United's slide into mediocrity continued, the man who had shaped George's career, Matt Busby, retired with his knighthood to the job of general manager.
Busby was his mentor. He was like his father, and I mean, he made sure he looked after him, and he looked after him through thick and thin.
Sir Matt handled George. You know, you've only got to sit and spend a moment or two with George to understand how close they were.
George's new manager was Wilf McGuinness, a former Busby babe and England international who'd been a coach for Matt Busby and Alf Ramsey.
It wasn't easy for Wilf McGuinness. The problem was that the power of the man in charge and the record of the man in charge was such that it was almost impossible for anybody to take over from him.
If I'd have been more experienced, I would have handled different situations better, but I couldn't possibly be his father figure because I'd grown up with most of the players.
George is very much his own man. He's a one-off. I don't think anybody could really handle it. If something was in his mind he didn't want to do or he wanted to do, I think it would be hard to persuade him to change his mind.
Lacking focus and motivation, Best allowed his willful personality to triumph over his professionalism, and for the first time in his career began to miss training.
You never, ever miss training. Because that was you really left yourself wide open for the manager to haul you in the office and give you an almighty rollicking.
Once that happened, you know, then there was a little bit of acrimony crept in, which is not good.
A number of people did get, you know, very angry and very upset in a very professional way. We were turning out training, why wasn't he?
He missed training this particular day and obviously called in George, what happened? And he was very honest in many ways. And he said, well, Wilf, I went into town, into Blinkers, saw this darling girl. She came home, I fell asleep, and I just didn't wake up.
We always sort of welcomed him back, and it was great to have him back, because he was one of us, he was one of our pals, and you wanted to help him and sort of get him through it.
He was his own man, and he had his own lifestyle, and it seemed to be what he wanted to do. So not for me to criticise. And I never criticised him other than when he didn't turn up.
Manchester United was slipping down the First Division. After a run of poor results, Wilf McGuinness was sacked, and Sir Matt Busby returned as manager. At a time when the club needed Best the most, George was becoming increasingly isolated from the team.
They were playing in London against Chelsea. George missed the train, and that was the start of the big problem at that time.
George later made his own way to London, but didn't meet up with his teammates. Word soon spread that Best was missing, and Busby's patience was wearing thin.
I had no contact. He's made no contact. And as I said to all you lads this morning, he knows where to find me. The door's there waiting for him. I'm not going looking for Best.
After a search which has gone on in London and Manchester all day, it's at last been established that he's here, at this flat in Islington, North London. It's the home of a 22-year-old actress, Sinead Cusack.
When he was with Sinead Cusack, he was looking at the television, watching a news broadcast in which he would be featuring, and it would be like, I mean, the way he described it, it was like watching somebody else. He became disassociated from himself.
And I always remember saying to him, I said, you know, George, there's so many people worry about you, so many people care about you. I said, you know, just go back.
Well, George Best will be going back to Manchester by car later tonight. At lunchtime tomorrow, he says he'll be going to see the boss, who's Sir Matt Busby.
George returned to face Busby and was suspended for 2 weeks. But the breach between player and club grew ever wider. Still unsettled, George fled to the sunnier shores of Marbella in Spain to contemplate his future.
Well, I don't know. I've got no plans at all. I just turned up and got to stay here and think a few things over and see what happens.
What happened next had a kind of tragic inevitability. George Best announced his retirement. He was not yet 26 years old. The game seemed to be over for Best, United, and for football.
I suppose someone might try and make me change my mind, but like I said, I've made my mind up, so that's it.
You can't pin any happening, any person. You can't say that because this happened, George went over the top. That's not true. And he knows it's not true. I mean, there's in George a devil that goes to work, and it would have gone to work had he been playing for the Celestial 11 in heaven.
Back in Manchester, United's new manager, Tommy Docherty, thought that he could keep the club in the First Division. But it would be a tremendous struggle with the ageing team that he had inherited.
Docherty was going to do things his way, and he wasn't terribly interested in the past, which perhaps was right by that time. You know, there were too many people looking back and still saying, well, you know, 68 and all of that.
I looked at the standard at the club and it was poor, very, very poor. Pat Clare and Sir Matt Busby, God rest his soul, thought that George could do us a turn. And I was all for it. I thought, yes, why not?
After 11 months of self-imposed exile, George Best returned to his spiritual home, overweight and unfit.
Well, I missed the game. I want to play again, and it's as simple as that. It took me a long time to make the decision, but I want to get fit. I want to play football again because I've missed it so much.
In the league, bad results meant that Best was rushed back into a first team heading for relegation, but he still managed to show glimpses of his natural ability. In the FA Cup, United were drawn at home to Plymouth Argyle.
Playing that day, I had them down to play. But I was holding on for a bit, and the team sheets had to be into the referee at 2:30. He wasn't there at 2:30, so I'd gone in and changed the team sheets with the referee and the manager of Plymouth Argyle.
And the doc maintained he came to a game, that he hadn't trained one day, that he came to a game with a girl who was drunk.
And I went to the door, and he was standing there with a young lady, and he certainly was in no condition to play football. And I said, George, there's no way you can play in the condition that you're in. I said, I'll see you on Monday, and we'll talk about it. He wasn't pleased, as I could see. Monday arrived, and I never saw him again. I never saw him again at all.
Best has always disputed Docherty's version of events. But whatever happened that day, one thing was clear. George Best had played his last game for Manchester United.
George does blame, I suppose I've heard he blames me for a lot of things that happen. But I say to people, well, there's only one person ruined George Best's career. It was George Best.
All the people that used to love going to watch him play were suddenly denied. He was only 27. Really, he had plenty of... I mean, he had so much natural ability, he would have played until he was 30, 35 or 36 without any difficulty.
The days of the impish Irish magician at Old Trafford had long disappeared. He had been the greatest player of his time, but his time on the world stage was over. After 466 games, 178 goals, 2 championship medals and the European Cup, George left Manchester United on their way into Division 2.
It felt like life could not really go on, and life didn't really go on, to be honest. We had to drop down to the second division before life went on.
When you leave a club like Manchester United, you're only going one way. Unless you're going to Barcelona or one of the big Italian clubs or Real Madrid, you're only going one way, and unfortunately for George, he was going the wrong way.
George was disillusioned with life in Britain, and the prospect of settling in the American sunshine was much more appealing. At the age of 27, George Best flew to Hollywood and signed for the LA Aztecs.
George went there and he was still a young man, and Pelé went there, Beckenbauer, they all went there because there was a razzmatazz about football in America at the time.
It was like being on holiday and playing, and earning good money and having a game football. The games were serious enough, but the way we all lived out there at the time was absolutely fantastic.
George shared a flat with fellow player Bobby McAlinden, and the pride in his profession returned as he began to regain his old fitness levels.
He got himself in tremendous shape the first year he was here. He looked $1 million, and he played like it too. I mean, you know, he more or less carried the team.
We played against him one day and we went into overtime and he got the winning goal. I think he beat 5 players that particular day and scored the winning goal.
George was relishing a fresh start on the pitch and enjoying life away from the British media. When he met Angela McDonald-Janes, they were able to enjoy a relationship out of the spotlight.
Nobody knew who he was. Nobody cared who he was. And we were just having a good time together. You know, we'd go grocery shopping together and go to the movies, and nobody would look at him. And that was wonderful.
But for an alcoholic, temptation is never far away. And George could resist everything except temptation.
During the periods of when we played, if he was drinking, it didn't really have an effect on him. The effect came when, in the off-season, when he wasn't playing and he had a lot of time on his hands.
Alcohol was a problem from the very beginning, but I was very young. I knew nothing about alcohol. I knew nothing about alcoholics. I thought he was just one of the boys and needed, as all women do, to settle down, to be mothered. You know, I can look after him, I can take care of him, I'll change him. I did all that. I had the Florence Nightingale syndrome.
George married Angie in Las Vegas, where he lost all his money at the tables. There was no honeymoon. Not even the arrival of their son Callum could change George.
Callum was a year old, and I'm driving down the street in San Jose. It's raining, it's a really dreary, miserable day. And in the middle of the street, the 2 yellow lines, there's this creature walking towards me, soaking wet, miserable, just huddled over like this, like a homeless person. And I realized it was my husband. And then I looked at my son and I thought, I can't do this anymore. I can't look after 2 babies. So the big one has to go.
In desperation, Angie sent George back to England for rehabilitation. George found it in his own unique way with Miss World Mary Stavin.
God bless George. He comes home to England. He's here for a week. He meets Miss World and they fall madly in love. And I'm sitting in California going, only he could do this. Only George.
The list of clubs George made comebacks with grew. Fulham, Fort Lauderdale, Hibernian, the San Jose Earthquakes. It was a litany of despair for the player and his fans.
By that time, he'd gone as a player. In a sense, you know, the tragedy of George was a long goodbye, basically, playing for clubs that, you know, he would never have considered in his pomp, nor should he ever have considered.
George's downward spiral continued. In November 1982, Best was declared bankrupt. In November 1984, he was arrested for drunk driving.
I mean, I was with him the day that he got arrested, or the morning he got arrested. We were in tramps, me, him, and my girlfriend and his. And I left him about 5 in the morning. I went home, and about 6 when somebody from the Sun rang up and said, "I understand you just left Bestie." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, he's been nicked."
George was bailed and due to appear in court later that day. He fell asleep and missed his court appearance, which led to a warrant being issued for his arrest.
The police turned up to arrest him. There were 7 carloads of police. How 7 carloads of police to arrest who? Not me, George Best. So anyway, George by this time has got a hangover. Not feeling very well, so he decides to make a run for it. And the guy grabs him and says, "Not as fast as we used to be, are we, Mr. Best?"
George Best's appeal against his prison sentence has been rejected. He'll spend Christmas behind bars. He was appealing against the severity of the sentence, 12 weeks for driving with excess alcohol, assaulting a police officer and jumping bail.
Suddenly he's in jail for 3 months. I mean, it was very, very unfortunate, and I think he was a victim in that case entirely of his own celebrity.
As George Best went through his life, what you got to understand is he sold newspapers, and that's what it's all about.
Perhaps because of his vulnerability and the very public nature of his alcoholism, Best never lost the love of his many fans. In 1995, he added the love of his second wife when he married Alex Percy. Despite his continual battles with drink and the serious medical problems he has endured, George Best will remain loved and admired by everyone who ever saw him play. A true legend in the history of football.
Put a spell on you. Cause you're mine.
The thing about him, of course, is he doesn't see any of his life as being a tragedy at all. I mean, the point he makes is that that's the life that he chose to lead. And if anyone wants to make a tragedy out of it, that's their problem, not his.
The memories that he's left are sufficient to be able to say, yes, we saw the best of George Best.
You know I can't stand it.
People who love great players, great entertainers, great footballers, stopped watching George when I stopped watching George. It's as simple as that. But what we saw while he was at the top was the best. And for that, we should be forever grateful.
Someday, when I'm awfully low, when the world is cold, I will feel a glow just thinking of you, just the way you look tonight.